Let's take a look at some of the new brushes that I created for Corel Painter in September of 2017. The first brush that we'll take a look at is called Oily Pastel. This was previously located in the rendering palette, but now it's in Oily. Here's Oily Pastel, and if we make a mark with this, it looks very much like an oily pastel. This brush is only compatible with Corel Painter 2018 and later. As you can see in this example, it works really well for drawing clouds. If you do little winding circular strokes, you can build up clouds like this. You could select a green color, and you could also use it with a bigger brush to put in some trees. You can see that the colors all kind of smudge together. So I picked a lighter green and I put some of that in. I could easily add highlights right on top. The next brush that we'll take a look at is called Selection Knife, and it's found in the Palette Knives category. This is a selection brush, so it's only going to work with Corel Painter 2018 and later. And what it does is it paints down this red area that represents the selection that you're going to create. So I can draw here to create kind of a wavy water pattern. You can see once I pick up my pen, the selection appears in place of the red. I'll go ahead and create a new layer to put my selection on. And I could either paint into my selection using a color if I want to. Could hide my selection while keeping it active with Ctrl-Shift-H. You can see the effect that that had. I created a nice shimmering water effect. But you can also use the interactive gradient tool to put a gradient into it as well. So for example, I could choose this sunset gradient here, and then I can draw in a gradient to fill that selection. I can also use the selection brush to subtract pixels from a layer. So I'll just paint here, drawing the mark that I want. And then I'll just clear the pixels on that layer, and you can see that I can punch a hole in it, so I can use it subtractively as well. The next brush that we'll look at is a blender. It's called Grainy Blender. As its name implies, it can use the paper grain. So right now my basic paper is selected. This is the default paper. And if I blend, you can see that I get something like this. However, I can change my paper to get different results. So I'm going to change it to simulated wood grain, increase the paper scale and contrast to their maximum. And now when I blend, I'm getting a different kind of texture that looks more organic. If I change my paper to something else, let's say pebbleboard, then I'm getting that pebbleboard texture when I blend. The next brush that we'll look at is called Messy Dab Impasto. That's found in the rendering category. As its name implies, it uses impasto. So if you paint and you build it up, you can kind of see there's lumpiness, a three-dimensional texture to the paint there. Now that texture is being controlled by the dab stencil. So if we look in dab stencil right now, that's being controlled by flow map. If I change it to something like fine dots, then there's that dotted texture in my paint as I build it up. If I change it to fish skin, then I get kind of a fish skin lizard texture. I can go to my flow maps panel. If I want to control the size of that fish skin, I can do that to make it finer. And I can even change the dab stencil from flow map to something like paper, which will let me choose any of these papers. Or I can choose texture, which will let me choose any of these textures. I could even import a photograph if I wanted to and use that as a texture. This is also a glazing brush, and so it builds up on itself as a glazing brush would. So if you use light pressure, you can get a thinner glaze that's more transparent. If you use heavier pressure, you can get a thicker glaze. You can build up the color like this. You can also choose the merge mode, which is right now set to multiply, but if I wanted to have my color build up lighter on itself, I could choose screen. And you can see that it builds up lighter and lighter. And I can use light pressure to get a thinner light glaze and build it up. There's lots of other merge modes you can play with, but typically you're using multiply or screen, but primarily multiply if you want a natural glazing effect. And the last custom brush that we'll look at is technically not a brush, it's an image hose nozzle. That can be found in the Painterly category of my image hose nozzle library, and it's called Impressionist Stones. We can use this to quickly paint hundreds or thousands or millions of stones. This image hose nozzle recommends that we use linear size P for our image hose brush. We need an image hose brush in order to paint with a nozzle. So let's choose linear size P. And if we paint, then we're spraying out all these different stones. Now it's best to work from background to foreground, starting with a smaller brush and then having your brush get bigger as you move into the foreground. So I'm going to make my brush pretty big, but I'm going to use lighter pressure so that my stones are smaller, and then I'll just make my pressure firmer as I move into the foreground. And that gives me that sense of perspective. The other reason for doing it background to foreground is because you want your foreground stones to overlap your background stones. not the other way around. You can also just click with your mouse to create just a few stones if you don't want a whole bunch. And then of course, the smaller you make your brush, the smaller the stones will be. The larger you make your brush, the larger the stones will be. Now, if you want to add color to these stones, you can do that two different ways. The first is you can paint some stones on a layer. You can right-click on that layer and choose Select Layer Content. Create a new layer above that layer. Change the composite method of that new layer to multiply. Hide your selection with Ctrl-Shift-H. Select the color that you want to tint your rocks. And then select something like the airbrush and just tint over your rocks to change their color. You can even add multiple colors if you want to. There's another option for coloring your rocks as well. You can choose Linear Size P Color. This is the color version of the Linear Size P brush. And in order to choose the color, you have to click on your additional color here, which is that background dot, and then choose the color that you want to tint the rocks. And if I paint, you can see that I get brown rocks. If I choose blue, then I get blue rocks. Now it's important that when you're done working with an image hose nozzle that's using the additional color, you remember to click back on your main color, because most other brushes in Corel Painter are only going to be able to use your main color, and you might get kind of frustrated because you're trying to choose the color that you want for some other brush and you're stuck on the additional color. Just click on the main color and then you'll be fine. So there you go, those are the custom brushes for Corel Painter that I created in September 2017. If you want to download these brushes, you can get them on my website at aaronrutten.com. There's a link in the video description below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.